Hi everyone and welcome to Module 4, Gender, Leadership and Intersectionality. We're more than halfway done the course already. I can't believe it. I've chosen this picture because it represents so much of what we'll be discussing in this module. Several years ago, Rebecca Coulter, and you'll remember her as one of the authors of an article earlier in the course, and I were invited by the Education Board at Walpole Island, an Indigenous community about an hour from Western University in Ontario, which is where we both were at the time. We were asked to do a study and provide them with a report on their school and how to improve its practices and results. Rebecca and I consulted over several weeks with school staff, the principal, community members, the high school admin at the high school that the young people from Walpole Island attended, and so on. I think we even talked to the people at their nursery school. We provided an extensive report with many recommendations and resources, and about 5 years later, after administrative changes and other challenges, another team was asked to do a report and found ours sitting on a shelf. There had been, as I said, there had been administrative changes and a lot of things going on in the community, and not much had happened with that report. But when this team that had come in read it, they asked if anything had been implemented and recommended that our recommendations be revisited. Among them was a suggestion to develop leadership from within the community to support the Board of Education and school leadership. It was shortly after that Rebecca was approached about setting up a master's cohort-based program that would take place in the community and at the university and online, sort of like the MES program in many ways. However, the emphasis would be on Indigenous educational leadership. By this time, I was at the U of A, but I received permission very happily to return for a month that summer to teach the first course in the program. That cohort all graduated and published a book on their research and have gone on to lead in so many important ways in schools and ministry positions that benefit Indigenous students right across the province. This wonderful group of educators and scholars that you see graduating here demonstrates in so many important ways the notion of intersectionality. And by the way, here's Rebecca in her U of A regalia because she did her PhD at the U of A. So in case you do your PhD and you want to get regalia, this is what you'll look like. But anyway, this wonderful group of educators graduating here demonstrate in so many important ways the notion of intersectionality. That is the compounding of vulnerabilities and opportunities for change at the intersections of race, class, language, gender, ableness, and so on. And that's what we're going to discuss in this module, Gender, Leadership, and Intersectionality. The 4 papers in this module consider these layered forms of discrimination based on gender, race, class, citizenship status, religion, and so on, and the ways in which they intersect with one another in school practices in ways that may compound multiple forms of oppression in relation to gender. Tanya Fitzgerald is at La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia. She's an Irish woman living in Australia, but she was asked by Indigenous women school leaders with whom she had been working to work with them to research Indigenous women in school leadership. And they chose her because they trusted her to help them magnify their voices. So she talks about her awareness of her position of privilege in relation to these women, but through negotiations between them, they found a way to ensure that the voices of Indigenous women leaders in education from Australia, New Zealand, and eventually Canada were primary in the research, and you'll find all of those voices in this paper. Sharon Curtis is nursery manager at Ellesmere Children's Centre in Sheffield, UK. And is committed to working as a social justice advocate on behalf of the marginalized children, their families, and their community that are served by the children's centers she leads. Her paper explores the experience of Black women in school leadership, and her findings point to not only the challenges that these women experience, but also the strength that comes out of those challenges. That strength meant that rather than viewing their circumstances through a deficit lens, they developed their cultural literacy and used it as a vehicle for social justice for themselves and the students and communities that they served. I've already introduced Chris Bruner in Module 2, and I've got her picture here, but she is really the co-author. The lead author is Mary J. DeLeon. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of her, who is the primary author, as I said. DeLeon and Bruner wrote a fulsome and fascinating account of the experience of gay and lesbian educational leaders It's a long paper, but several pages up front talk about the complex and very careful approach they needed to engage in order to work ethically with gay and lesbian leaders who were and still are highly vulnerable in the school systems and communities in the US, in which LGBTQ plus educators are openly harassed and find themselves in a legal environment in which their protections are very limited. You can decide whether or not you read the methodology pages if you happen to be assigned that paper as the one that you'll report on. Those pages are from 165 to 170. But for those of you thinking about doing research with vulnerable populations, they're actually kind of interesting as an example of how to work ethically with vulnerable participants to protect identities and so on. You're free to skip that section, however, if you wish, in order to make the reading length more reasonable. What follows in this interesting paper, however, is a fascinating exploration of the substantial personal and professional challenges facing gay and lesbian educational leaders and the ways in which they eventually not only meet those challenges, but gain strength from them, a theme that recurs in these papers. Last is a chapter from our book, Transforming Conversations by Dr. Ldshp Pillay. Ldshp is a graduate from the doctoral program in Ed Policy Studies and is now assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University. I had the pleasure of having her as a student in one of my classes, and we often had conversations around her social justice work. Ldshp is a remarkable young woman who applies a critical lens to her everyday experiences as an immigrant, a student, a teacher, and a feminist, and argues for the decolonizing knowledges that are privileged in schools. In this paper, she uses her own experiences as a young immigrant child in a school in which her knowledges had no place, and then as a teacher in an indigenous school in the North where she was both the other, that is, outside of the cultural norms of that community, and teaching those who experienced discrimination at a deeply cultural and racial level, much as she had, but in ways that are embedded in historical relations between Aboriginal peoples and the state in Canada. All of these papers are a fascinating look at how intersectionality works in educational settings to both marginalize and in many ways empower. As the history of activism around gender in educational settings demonstrates, it has what Loretto calls a white default. That is, the results of activism around gender has mainly benefited white, middle-class, cisgender educators. For example, the historical record of activism that questioned the labor arrangements around leadership in schools that privileged white, middle-class, cisgendered men, was opposed by women's organizations that were primarily white, middle-class, cisgender women. And the benefits that came out of that activism were enjoyed predominantly, and not surprisingly, by white, middle-class, cisgender women. That is, white feminism was not as inclusive as it needed to be of the experiences, desires, and hopes of Black, Indigenous, lesbian, immigrant, and differently abled women. In many ways, minority women's voices were being ignored by majority women, just as majority women's voices had been ignored by men in educational institutions. Intersectional feminists argue that it was essential for advocates to fight for the rights of all women in order to address the painful exclusions that were part of minority women's history. Kimberly Crenshaw was the lawyer and advocate that came up with the term intersectionality in response to meeting a woman whose case, on the face of it, seemed winnable, but the court ruled against her. I'm going to read a short section from the book Transforming Conversations that explains the vexing and very perplexing legal issue that left racialized women with no redress in the courts because of this very intersectionality that we've been talking about. Okay, so we write, the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, as we've said, a Black feminist legal scholar, in her analysis of a case in which the federal courts dismissed the complaint of African American women who felt that they had been denied access to better jobs. The court ruled that the complaint fit neither race discrimination, because Black men were not barred from better jobs, nor sex discrimination, because white women were not barred from better jobs. This tortuous logic revealed the limits of so-called identity politics and the dominance of a particular orientation that disaggregates or separates social problems into discrete challenges facing specific groups. Instead, intersectionality, she argues, offered a way to consider oppression across categories in ways that revealed, rather than concealed, multiple layers of exclusion. You can actually go to the additional readings tab for a link to a TED Talk that Crenshaw did, in which she explains the legal issues involved that led her to consider this term intersectionality. It turned out to be a powerful term that resonated with many who were trying to come to terms with the complexities of multiple layers of discriminatory behavior. And it was a word that was taken up in many social contexts, including education. So I'm now going to turn to a video that's less than 2 minutes long, in which Crenshaw talks about the meaning of intersectionality to educators.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
The poem that Pillay begins her chapter with speaks so well to what Crenshaw describes when considering the experience of students at the intersection of gender and other social identities that threaten to silence them, or students whose identities are not reflected in what they hear in their schools. Salmon, the author that the poet that she quotes, says, "I must speak bilingual, neither one of them mine. I must study centuries of history, none of it mine. I read 1,000 voices, none of them speak to me. Not one of them speak to me. Am I entirely obscure? I see you talk and teach, but I can't hear a word you say." This poem reflects Crenshaw's remarks that raise some important issues for us as educators about what kinds of schools and educational institutions we wish to be a part of. I suspect that most of us would say we want our schools to be places in which students' learning prepares them for a successful future, however successful might be defined by them, and that they will go on to contribute to making the world a better place. We want our classrooms to be caring and organized for excellent learning opportunities, and we want our pedagogy and curriculum to enable each student to achieve their full potential. So what potentially stands in the way of achieving those goals? There may be many challenges, but Crenshaw reminds us that schools can do a better job of achieving those goals when they understand the relationship between identity, that is, who I am, the way I think about myself, the way I am viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define me. All the parts of my identity and their relationships with history, community, and institution. For me, as a white middle-class cisgendered able student, when I was in school, that was an easy one for me because the school's activities, curriculum, both explicit and hidden, the language and the social practices of the school reflected back to me my identity. However, what the articles we're reading for this unit suggest is that those who live at the intersections of gender and the minority status of race, gender and sexual identity, gender and citizenship, and we could add gender and disability, gender and class, often don't see themselves in the everyday practices, the curriculum and the pedagogy of their school. Further, they may experience racism, classism, homophobia, rejection, and a lack of inclusion. In effect, their history, culture, community affiliations, forms of knowledge, etc., are simply not a part of the school curriculum or the school environment, its daily practices and representation in public displays and so on, and they feel silenced, censured, and misunderstood when they introduce other ways of knowing, being, and doing. We've seen this in Canadian schools with Aboriginal students, and we have seen the results when what Crenshaw suggests is essential for schools to meet the needs of all students are not extended to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. Pillai's chapter makes clear how silencing of minority voices, its history, its knowledge, and its identities had a profound effect on her as a young immigrant girl. And it's this theme of silencing that I see in every one of these papers. It might be called being in the closet, for example, or something else, but it's arguably a profound silencing that shapes schooling for minority students, especially those at the intersection of gender and race, or minority sexual identities, or immigrant status, and so on. And this happens often in quite destructive ways. Sadly, we may also see this being played out with colleagues as well, who live at these same intersections. They live with the same absences and silencing that students do, and their valuable voices may be muted rather than included in the grand conversation of education. This theme of silencing of minority voices in schools can lead to the exclusion of the experience, knowledge base, and history that Black female leaders, Aboriginal women leaders, and gay and lesbian educators can offer, and therefore represents a loss to the school community. However, as all of the papers remind us, exclusion, silencing, and other tactics of discrimination that these educators may face also has the potential to cause an equal and opposite reaction within these leaders that strengthens their determination to become a leader for social justice, contribute to a richer fabric of knowledge in the school through expressing their full identity, and provide a model and guide not only to other minority students who benefit from seeing someone like themselves in their schools and classrooms, but also non-minority children in extending their awareness of many ways of being in the world that contribute to everyone's knowledge and well-being. So as you read your assigned paper, I hope you'll identify both resistance to the experiences and voices of the research participants, as well as the benefits that those voices offer to their school and community. After all, if we want the kinds of schools and educational institutions and systems that Crenshaw talks about and that these authors talk about, one in which each child and young person and adult or learner is able to achieve their full potential, then each paper in this module provides important clues about how that will be attained. I'm really looking forward to learning from your input on the forum in this module as you explore the meaning of intersectionality in schools and school settings, both its challenges and its possibilities. And again, if you have any questions about anything at all, please feel free to let me know.